Welcome, everybody. We are so delighted to be with you today and to be talking about a book that has quite a few phenomenal and diverse reflections on teaching and learning in Jewish day schools. To talk about this wonderful collection of essays that has come out, we have with us three panelists who we admire deeply and who have read this book and have tremendous thoughts to share with us, discussion to share with us, and ideas. As always, we invite audience participation. Please, as you're listening and thinking along with us, feel free to throw questions into the Q&A, and we will absolutely get to them at the end of our session. We have left tons of time. I want to turn it over to John to talk a little bit about the project that this book was, and then I will introduce each of our panelists, and we will start the conversation. John.
Thanks, Ziva. Good to be with you, and thank you in advance to our colleagues for taking the time to read the book and think with us about the book. So the book, Teaching and Learning in Jewish Day Schools, which was just recently published, Brandeis University Press, in the Mandel-Brandeis book series. It emerged from a project with our colleague Jonathan Krasner. He's actually the lead author, and he was supposed to be playing the role that I'm playing right now, but unfortunately he's sick today, so I'm stepping in. So a few years back, Jonathan and I were talking together. This was just when he was beginning to do his historical work around the evolution of Jewish day schools in the post-war period. And we were talking about the idea of bringing together all of the relevant scholarship on contemporary Jewish day schools. And particularly, we were thinking about sociological scholarship. He's a historian, I'm a philosopher, but we were really thinking if we could zoom in on sociological, social scientific studies of Jewish day schools, and even more specifically around teaching and learning. So there are other important aspects of Jewish day schools, of course, and we care about those things, whether that's the politics of Jewish day schools, the economics of Jewish day schools, questions around enrollment, all those important questions. But we wanted to kind of narrow our focus in on teaching and learning. That was our primary concern. So we did what academics often do, which is we create a conference, and we realized that we had never, in our careers, we had never remembered a conference that was focused specifically on research on Jewish day schools. So this felt like, well, that's an important contribution to make. We ran the conference, and then some of the papers that were presented at the conference continued to be part of our project. We solicited other papers. There was a call for proposals. And in the end, we ended up with 13 really fabulous chapters, each one of which tackles a different aspect of teaching and learning in Jewish day schools. Jonathan then wrote the introduction. I wrote the conclusion, and altogether we have this book. Now, there's a kind of glass half full and glass half empty way of thinking about the book, which is each of these studies is quite particular. It tackles a particular aspect of teaching and learning in Jewish day schools. The book doesn't offer a kind of comprehensive, wide-ranging analysis of teaching and learning in Jewish day schools. Nobody is making grand claims about what Jewish day schools, what students learn in all Jewish day schools, how teaching happens in all Jewish day schools. Those are good projects, but they're not what this book is about. This book was intentionally, each chapter is around a specific area. And you might think, well, how is that possibly useful? How is that generalizable? If we know, I don't know, if we know about the teaching of Tanakh in a particular school, or the teaching of Halacha, or teaching of Israel, or various other things, how is that actually useful? And that's a good question. It's a good question to think about. But I always feel like that's that is generative. That kind of those specific cases are then generative for more thinking. So my shorthand for this is if this is true, if whatever the findings that of that particular chapter, if it's true in this particular location, well, that raises a question. Is it true in other locations? Is it true in other schools? Is it true in other times? Is it true of other people? And to my mind, that question is actually can be really helpful for the field. So I'm proud of the work that we did on teaching and learning Jewish day schools. I think it makes a wonderful contribution to the field, and I'm eager to hear from our colleagues.
Great. Thank you, John. So I want to introduce our panelists. I want to sort of celebrate these three leaders in the field who really, in my mind, are sort of paradigms of leadership in all areas of Jewish education, but in particular in Jewish day schools. And also say that together, I hope that we can have a really fun conversation and sort of both explore how you read this book, given your expertise and experiences, but also just who you are as a reader, who you are as a Jew, who you are as a parent, who you are as uh, a child who once went to school. So who do we have with us today? We have Rabbi Dr. Tali Zelkowicz, who is currently Director of Curriculum and Research at Wexner Foundation. She's a sociologist of Jewish education, who is endlessly fascinated by cultural straddling and the way we manage the tensions that are produced by being a part of and apart from American lives as Jews. Tali herself is widely published. In 2016, after a decade of research, writing, and teaching, she and leading the management degree programs at HUC, Tali was fortunate to be able to translate her research on integration and identity work into practice at the Columbus Jewish Day School, where she served there as head of school before her current position now at the Wexner Foundation. Along with Tali, we have Amanda, who is head of school at Luria Academy of Brooklyn, where she is responsible for all aspects of the day-to-day function of the school. And I've heard rumors that even you're responsible for Jewish life outside of the day-to-day of school, that your job doesn't end when the school day ends, but that you're actually leading the community in every aspect. During her 8 years as head of school, the enrollment, which might be interested to Dan, when I introduce Dan, you'll understand why, has grown from 97 students to over 300 students. At Luria, Amanda has a vision of education where children get to prioritize play, developing friendships, learning how to respect their peers, regardless of their background or affiliation, or learning style or learning needs. And prior to becoming head of school, Amanda served as Associate Director at the Brandeis Institute for Brandeis Educators. Our third panelist is another broadly accomplished scholar who has written for a number of different publications, Dr. Dan Held, who is currently the Chief Program Officer at UJA, Federation of Greater Toronto. There, he is responsible for the organization's strategy to strengthen the vibrancy and vitality of Jewish Toronto. Before that, Daniel previously served as the executive director at UJA's Julia and Henry. Oh, that's a hard name. Help me, Dan. Kaczynski Center for Jewish Education, overseeing the work in Jewish education and engagement there. Daniel has always been a passionate educator, and he never stops teaching. He holds a doctorate in Jewish education, and of course, to pull it all together, is also an alum of the Wexner Fellowship and Davidson Scholar Program. The three of you, I want to thank you so much for taking the time in the middle of the day, Amanda, even on Grandparents' Day or Grandparents' Special Friends, whatever we now call it, day, to join us and to really help us as a group think about how we can use this book, not just as sort of beautiful accounts of teaching, but also as actual thought partners. So the question that I want to pose for the three of you, and we'll start with Tali and we'll move to Amanda and then Dan, but also after that, put you three in conversation with each other, and John and I will step back, is If you could share with us an enduring dilemma of practice that you have experienced in your particular area of expertise, and maybe even to go a step further and reflect, given that dilemma of practice, how have some of the essays published in this volume helped you, pushed you, challenged you, advanced your thinking on that particular dilemma of practice? Tali, is it okay if we start with you?
Sure. Hi. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I apologize for my rather sparse background. I'm usually in a more interesting place, but I actually happen coincidentally to be in Boston, but I'm not at home. It's really, really an honor to be here, especially with my great colleagues, Dan and Amanda and Ziva and John. This is really fun, and Jenny. Um, so it's a great question. I love the frame and the lens that Ziva, you've invited us to begin with. I want to begin by sharing kind of 5 lenses that I came to this book with. I come to the conversation today as a researcher who has written about the productive and counterproductive tensions in liberal Jewish day schooling specifically. I also come as having worked for a decade in day school leadership through teaching, through the DELIT program in Los Angeles, helping to prepare teachers for classrooms. And I come to the book as a Reform rabbi and educator who is a passionate advocate for Jewish day schooling. I come, as you said, as a past head of school, Columbus Jewish Day School, K through 5 community day school in Columbus, progressive education. And finally, I come as an IMA of 2 day school graduates. So a central dilemma of practice through which I really read the whole book through, and probably, if I'm honest, read all of Jewish education through pretty regularly, can be heard through the 2 sentences that I'm going to share of philosopher of education Israel Scheffler, who was actually reflecting on his own experience attending Jewish day school between the 1930s and 1940s. And here's what Scheffler said. What synthesized the 2 parts of our education seemed to be just the fact that they happened to occupy the same days of our academic calendar. We were left with the problem of synthesis, but could expect no help from official quarters in its solution. We felt the strong pull of both worlds and had ourselves to figure out how to deal with it. I've thought about this quote and the implications behind it for probably over 20 years in different ways. How does that strong pull of both worlds feature today? Who should be and who is figuring out how to deal with it? What is it a problem that can or should be solved? I think it's definitely a tension, but under what circumstances can it be a productive tension? And when might it be counterproductive for the learners, for the families, for the teachers, for funders? So this was the key organizing and enduring dilemma through which I read the essays in this volume, and through which I got pushed and challenged and advanced in my own thinking. In short, I think as Jonathan Sarna once put it, the question is how to navigate being both a part of and apart from American society as Jews. And since Dan and I are both on this call as Canadians, I want to add that I think we can ask the same question of Canadian Jewish life if we also acknowledge that their Canadian life is distinct in important ways. So I'm going to dive into a few chapters, but I want to just comment that I think it's modernity that made it possible for Jews to live in 2 worlds at once, but we might say that it was post-modernity that allowed us to be part of the larger American society and apart from it simultaneously. My dear teacher, David Ellenson, really put it best in 2008 when he wrote about this new cultural possibility in which the values of Judaism not only complement and inform, but also stand in dynamic tension with the values of the host culture. So it's this larger dynamic tension in which things like preservation and transformation are in tension, transmitting tradition and collective inheritance for meaning and translating it for individual meaning. The tension between me and us, between intellectual understanding and emotional connection, between whole person well-being and excellence of achievement, supporting, challenging, following learners and leading learners is a recurring theme I heard in the book. And really the authority of text and canon and the importance of context and milieu for the learners. And so for me, it was really under one roof, intentionally, Jewish Day School aims to achieve these dual and what sometimes become dueling goals. So, reading through this dilemma of living in two worlds at once, I'm going to dive into Jonah Hassenfeld's study for a second in chapter 2, where he offers us a really strong case right out of the gate for rejecting educating for the love of Israel and certainly for a blind love of Israel. And he dares us to ask, what if Jewish education stopped trying to teach solely towards loving Israel and helping learners to develop a deep-grounded knowing of Israel? Not because he's not interested, I think, in people connecting to Israel or having a relationship with Israel, because he submits that students will develop their own genuine intensity of connection, even if it comes with criticism, if they are richly interacting with Israeli history, politics, and culture to inform an authentic, rooted investment and a chance at, this is my words, not his, a mature love. And so his research, I think, really uncovers this fascinating distinction that I hadn't really thought about explicitly before. The level of intensity of the teens that they feel toward Israel reveals more about their connection than the valence, whether they a positive or negative relationship to Israel. In other words, how strong your feelings are is more significant than whether you have positive or negative feelings. And that led me to my favorite quote of his whole piece. This study, he says, made me wonder whether connection without knowledge can be called connection at all. Honestly, I want to frame that and put it on the doorpost of every learning space in the world. The study made me wonder whether the connection without knowledge can be called connection at all. And that one sentence I really gave me pause, not just in Israel education, but all of Jewish education. And I'm grateful to Jonah for what I think is a brave countercultural reframe that challenges us to revisit what has become a kind of long-time pedagogical binary in Israel education. Should we teach for feeling and belonging, or should we teach for knowledge and understanding? And Jonah's data really exposed this as a false binary, and even moreover, as a short-sighted and superficial binary. And so rather than assuming that it's too complicated or too dangerous, he's really challenging us to trust that immersing the learners in the content will get us to a more integrated love and connection with Israel. And I hear a lot about, within Jonah's chapter, also about challenging and stretching learners and following them, meeting them where they're at and supporting them. I want to just quickly say, because it's going to come up for my reading of some of the other chapters, is that I heard that this might not just be, like John Levisohn said, an instance of one teaching, but it could actually be heuristically suggesting implications for many other settings. And it made me immediately think of Lee Shulman's pedagogic content knowledge concept of like, wow, if we can learn and go beyond just someone's subject matter expertise and their stellar ability as a pedagogue, but what if there is like a third area of expertise that comes from integrating and teaching, being able to teach a particular content area and know almost magically how learners are going to react and interact with a given content area, that develops PCK. And I think that Hassenfeld's chapter, Jonah's chapter, is suggesting that we can develop some PCK around Israel education. Thanks to, for example, Karen Freeman's recent article, Barriers to Entry, Exploring Educator Reticence for Engaging with the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, we know it's tricky in at least 4 specific ways that she outlines, but I think that there could be immense professional learning implications for PCK and Israel education. Thanks for this chapter. Similarly, I want to jump to another Hassenfeld. In Ziva's chapter, although now we're talking about Bible, it's really another countercultural reframe, because it's about the tension of also when to lead and when to follow learners, and also about when and how and under what conditions learners can and must be trusted to produce real new Jewish knowledge. And Ziva gives us this very cool new language, it was new for me, of intercomprehending, to talk about what she says is the emergent responsive work that readers undertake to make sense of a text while engaged in dialogue that builds and builds on collaborative ideational repertoire, or in short, talking to learn. Or what I thought of in my mind was kind of a speak weaving of meanings into existence. But here's this amazing catch. If you read between the lines of Ziva's piece, the focus, she says, of this article is whole class discussion, getting to that intercomprehending dessert. But she says the class couldn't have got to that culminating discussion without the 7 steps pedagogically that came before, and she outlines them. They had to have exposure to necessary background, preview of relevant vocab and grammar, reading aloud, translating the text in pairs, generating questions, reading classical commentaries, reader's theater. I'm already hearing a PCK at work here that ends up flipping, at least in my mind, the role of what a Bible teacher in especially elementary, but maybe even any age, could be. Instead of sort of holding Jewish traditional wisdom as the ultimate punchline that we're leading toward, I think she's flipping it and saying, no, 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 don't save that for some kind of mic drop from the tradition. Give that all away in some systematic, thoughtful way so that the ultimate end game actually is to say it's yours to the students and make room. And for the main event, the real main event is their voices and their collective meaning making of Torah. But to get there, it takes those 7 steps. And I'll just conclude my thoughts about Ziva's chapter with mentioning the bomb that she dropped at the end of the chapter. At least for me, it was like a bombshell anecdote where she says, oh, and by the way, I was in a conversation with a doctoral candidate who mentioned that she was doing this didactic teaching of a text, in other words, like really giving meanings rather than making room for students to co-construct. And Ziva clearly gently asked her to reflect on that choice. And the teacher said, laid it out and leveled with Ziva and said, like, dude, I'll quote directly, Ziva, the idea that students' questions and ideas about the text have value is so far from how these teachers I supervise around their roles, that goalpost is out of reach for my school, at my school. And my heart dropped and sunk. It wasn't news to me, but it was a really sad way to end the chapter. And I thought, wow, you could conclude from this anecdote, what a sad state of affairs for how our teachers are viewing their students. But then I thought backwards about the chapter and I thought, what if it's about something else? What if, thanks to Ziva's whole chapter and the PCK she suggests in the 8 steps, what if this sad and tragic gap is less about teachers struggling to imagine students taking on hermeneutical authority? And what if it's more about the teacher's own ability to imagine their own teacher agency to create the conditions that make that student textual authority possible in the first place? Maybe they've never experienced Ziva's class or anything like Ziva's class that actually invests weeks first to empower learners to develop those tools and habits and disciplines. So there were some really interesting applications for the teacher and not just sort of lamenting of, oh, our students are so limited. Just short comments, thinking through the lenses of living in 2 worlds. Chapter 5, Krasner, Aronson, and Magid, how do you say their name? Magid and de Kramer? Is that right? Okay. They challenged us to really step back and say, where do we even start when we design curriculum? Do we start with the content or do we start with the learners? And I'm always nervous about either or binaries. And in this case, I thought it was a really fascinating case for beginning with what the learners know and who they are. And it raises the questions, 2 questions for me, of what's our responsibility to challenge and stretch students beyond their baselines, to bring each learning opportunity. Like, what's the purpose of learning? Is it just to meet learners where they're at? And then we might be at risk for actually tracking as opposed to creating a productive differentiation of instruction. that's kind of where I was going in my mind with that chapter. In chapter 6 with Feynman, Nemser, and Horowitz, they did a really interesting thing. They introduced, I think, a third node to the dual curriculum of Jewish day school. So we have the academic Jewish and general curriculum, but then they say, guess what? Let's put the social on par with that, really rigorously, equally on par with that. And what if we looked at like kind of a three-part strong strand that was an intentional and rigorous social curriculum, and the importance of those three strands. And then my favorite part, and knowing Sharon Feynman Nemser, it was not a surprise. There's a quote. She says, in the battle for time, she's quoting one of the Dalit teachers, we need to remember that academics and social behavior are profoundly intertwined. In other words, it's not three separate or even two separate strands, but it's a single thick braid. It's a challah. So that was an interesting also like blending together of knowing and belonging. Just a couple more in chapter 8. Leiden calls for a better integration of all the parts of one's Jewish self as a teacher and for the learners too. And here it was really, really like I could hear Lee Shulman screaming in my ears, Zichrono Livracha. The C in PCK features here. I really think if we are going to take that seriously, we've got to wonder what the C in rabbinics is. In other words, pedagogic content knowledge. What kind of content is rabbinics? And Leiden teaches me that we lack some shared consensus around what kind of content rabbinics is, or even at least a way to talk about what are the different types that it can be. And he surfaces some of the deepest tensions, I think, that we have in Jewish education and Jewish identity forming. Like, are we teaching for revelation and God at Sinai and receiving tradition and canon as it should be, or is it about application of the text to contemporary life? And most profound, I think Leiden's larger case suggests that if we can help rabbinics teachers to increase their own level of self-awareness and reflective practice, it will in turn lead to affording the learners more expansive options for the development of their whole Jewish selves, which I thought was really lovely and elegant. One of my favorite chapters was Moshe Karkowski, who I couldn't be more different from probably in the whole book. He went in and studied first graders in Haredi and yeshivish schools, and I learned the most as a Reform educator from Krakowski's chapter. Why? So he's really invoking a unique application of managing the tension between what counts as skills and facts that are artificial to their students' lived lives and those that are experienced as authentic and real. And the short answer, I think, Moshe's short answer is it's all relative. It's relative to the lived community of the learners and whether or not the students know that they're being prepared for some eventual real life, mature version of that in their communities. And therefore, in the case, Moshe argues, no case rationale needs to be made for learning for the why of that content, because that's what we do here. That's what we do in this community. And that was a really revealing story to me about the role and significance of students' lives outside of school, including the home, which is what implicated for me the lives of non-Orthodox, progressive Jewish families. What is going on in their homes in contrast to what they're learning in school? And that gap can be really big and really confusing and painful for non-Orthodox families. But if Krakowski's correct, and my sense is that it really tracked for me, that the pedagogical practice is given meaning by that broader culture, then the gap between home and school can feel really too big. And it made me think of the sociologist of religion, Peter Berger. He has this idea of a plausibility structure. And to me, Krakowski's study invites those of us who are invested, let's say, in progressive or liberal Jewish education to consider certain factors that are necessary for the teaching and learning of Jewish texts as authentic. Have we asked, or do we ask, does the school culture have a clear message of what the nature of this knowledge is that we're teaching? Is it theological? Is it social? Is it literary? Is it cultural? Is it aesthetic? What are Jewish texts in a liberal community? What purpose are they serving? What meaning do they have? And to what extent does a classroom culture and discourse have a clear and explicit articulation of the expected contexts of use? I think that's the most acute pressure point in liberal settings. Where does this play out in the Haredi and yeshiva classrooms? It's very, very obvious. They're living it on a daily basis. So why it matters and when. And I thought all of that had a lot of implications for plausibility structure in liberal Jewish educational settings. And then I'll just quickly close with Shevitz's chapter, which is a topic very close to my heart, pluralism, where it's also a story of authenticity. And she focuses on pluralism and not Chumash, but she provides us with another story about what counts as learning authenticity. It asks, I think, a closely related question. How do you socialize learners to practices that are somewhat or significantly countercultural to what they're experiencing outside the classroom, in their home, and in the world broadly? So it's about the role and import of the alignment between what's transmitted explicitly and what's lived and modeled organically in the life of the lived community. But she goes actually one step further, I think, to warn us that this is especially true when the content and practices that are being taught are countercultural to the student's normative experience, as is, I think, the case in pluralism, unfortunately, more and more these days. And so that alignment between what's taught and caught, what's lived, must be there to establish that plausibility structure. And so I will close there and just end by saying I had this amazing moment as I was sitting there thinking about preparing for today, and I was staring at the cover of the book. And the cover of the book also matches the art behind John's office, weirdly, and maybe that's not a coincidence, but there's this like Venn diagram on the book that I suddenly saw, and I don't know if this was intentional or not, but this teal piece is like where I live. It's this overlap between the two big circles of like, how do we do both? And all these tensions are so valuable, and how do we live in this teal spot? And that was kind of my overarching hermeneutic.
Fabulous. Tali, thank you so much for those thoughts, for sort of animating that dilemma of practice, framing it both in the context of modernity, post-modernity, and then helping us see how these chapters and studies helped you think with it. I was thinking, I'm going to turn it over, Amanda, to you for a second to sort of share your dilemma of practice. And I was thinking, as you're making your poster, lahavdil between Annie Hassenfeld and Toni Morrison, but she has this line in Beloved, where Seth, who of course kills her own, I hope I'm not giving it away, but hopefully you all read it in Jewish day school and high school, who killed her own baby instead of returning to slavery. And then she has this line, too thick, love is or it ain't. Then love ain't love at all. And I think that sort of echoes some of what you're talking about as far as as how we relate to the tension. We need not be afraid of thick love.
Nice.
Amanda, can I pose the same question to you? What is an enduring dilemma of practice, given your work as head of school? And how some of the essays in this volume sort of helped you think through it?
Thank you. I need to start with a bio correction because I actually have been a head of school for 14 years.
I thought so.
And those of you who have been heads of school or are current heads of school or love a head of school know that every year feels like a decade when you're a head of school. So I need to
really
own all the years
that.
I've been in this.
I wanted to sort of ad lib and say, I think she's the longest standing head of school. And I was like, is 8 the longest? Anyways, I remember, great. Okay, 14 years, continue.
14 years, okay.
Correction.
So where I'm living right now is in this conversation around community. And what does it mean to hold a diverse community? I think, community day schools over the last 2 decades have really sort of become central to how we educate our students, our Jewish students. And the thing about being a diverse community and holding a diverse community has always been something that really animated me and really was my drive for being in this work. And I will say that, like, over the last 2 or 3 years, it's also become the thing that has felt the most challenging, and has really been my biggest dilemma. And to be honest, within this, group of people who are with us today, I can safely say sometimes I wonder if it's a fool's errand, right? Sometimes I wonder, like, given the polarized society around us and how people relate to each other, and our role models out there right now who, who don't approach each other with curiosity, who, don't even aren't even open to dialogue. I wonder, sort of, what are we doing here, and is there a path forward? And Tali, I really appreciate that you sort of, it's like you pitched me a softball right there, because, like, we didn't even plan this, but the piece that you sort of named at the end around how do we, sort of give our students this lived experience, this experience in schools and in the classroom, when their lived experience is the opposite, right? And I think that is getting worse and harder. And so what I'm seeing, and the dilemmas in front of me around, um, families that used to be sort of, that used to come for the diversity and come for the inclusivity, are much less willing to engage with those who are different from them. Teachers who are showing up and saying, parts of the mission of the school, I'm aligned with parts of the mission of the school, but there are certain things that you're doing or saying that just don't work for me, and I can't be a part of it. I'm separating myself, or I can't work here anymore. And these things that used to be sort of few and far between are now becoming the norm. And people are narrowing their tents and drawing their red lines and doubling down on what truth means to them. And I feel like I'm literally, like, standing, like, pushing, like, the walls as they're, like, closing in on the tent, and wondering, sort of, how do we do this, and how do we keep doing this, right? How do we teach the tools and dispositions of dialogue? How do we teach curiosity and openness when everything around us is really shutting it down? The grown-ups around our children are not modeling it. It's hard to even get the grown-ups who are teaching our students to model it these days. And I found this book, and there's a few chapters that I will speak to specifically, to just be, to almost come and, like, hold me up, right? To say, we got this. It's still working. We can still do it. There are still tools and strategies that can even get us through these very, very hard moments. So the pieces, just to name kind of where I'm going to take us, and what sort of was really reassuring to me, were kind of the strategies around creating culture, right? I think constantly about, what is the culture I'm creating? How do I create an intensive community culture? How do we think about culture building? And I think it's a different question now than it was a few years ago, because because it's much harder, right, to build and create and hold culture. And so a few of the kind of takeaways from this work, one is kind of entry points into community that I'll talk about. One that I am taking away, right? One is about, how do we create our classrooms as safe spaces, and what does that mean for facing the challenges of sort of divisive and polarized communities. One is explicit instructions for the community we're trying to build. And one is opportunities for students to bring their full selves. And these are things that I think they're essential for all good educators to be thinking about and holding. And I think as the world around us becomes more challenging and these things really sort of fall by the wayside, how do we hold them at the center? So I want to start with chapter 12, Designing Schools Around 5 Dimensions of Community, because Shira Hammerman brings us these 5 dimensions: geographic, occupational, interpersonal, inspired, and resident. And when I first started reading this chapter, I was both really inspired and also a little bit sad, because one of the things that Hammerman notices right away is that every teacher shares an experience of community that is multifaceted, nuanced, and inclusive. And that's really beautiful. And I think it's something that I used to see much more. And it's starting to sort of fall away. It feels like we're really moving away from this reality when we have these experiences that, a teacher says, there's things about this that don't align with my political beliefs, or I feel unwelcome because of something someone said. And they're so quick to kind of exit, or they're not open to, in ways that they used to, the interpersonal, the interpersonal dimension, or the inspired dimension, or the resonant dimension, right? There seems to be some closing off or an unwillingness to engage in community in these same ways. And I ultimately end it, and I would say, like, I understand the inclination to sort of give up on it, because I've felt it in hard moments. But as I was sort of reading through, one of the things that she says, by identifying multiple entry points into school community, the framework highlighted here provides practical insight into how to design schools so as to maximize opportunities for teachers to form connections that will benefit the school and the students, and is of particular usefulness to Jewish day schools that support diverse teacher populations within environments grounded in religious tradition and culture. So I think this idea of, what is actually our responsibility as educators and as administrators as we're designing our schools in this world that feels so hard to build community among, diverse people and diverse faculty, and among people who are digging so deeply into sort of their stance, and I'm not budging from here. But this invitation to kind of maximize the opportunities, it almost lifted a weight off of my shoulders of saying, I don't have to solve this. I don't have to do everything myself. I just have to create multiple entry points. And even if they find one, so maybe I won't be as successful as the school that studied in this, where teachers have multiple entry points and multiple overlaps, but maybe we start with one, right? Maybe our job is to really say out loud, are we doing everything we can to create these various ways that you can potentially connect? And then as they find connection and as they find each other and they're willing to engage with these different perspectives and different people who are kind of part of their community, maybe then they'll be open to a second or a third. So I think that sort of naming these 5 different dimensions really reminds us that our job is to make sure that we're thinking about these various dimensions and not worrying so much about one or the other, or is everybody a part of or have connection through various dimensions. So it was really a spoke to like exactly what I am feeling worried about right now. And I felt like it was a really nice reminder and invitation that you don't have to like really solve all of the problems at one time. So thank you for that, for chapter 12. I want to move to chapter 6, which again, Tali mentioned, and Sharon Feynman-Nemzer and Shira Horowitz, really focusing on sort of teachers, the DELET teachers' community building practice. And I just want to say out loud that those of us who are familiar with DELET, this sounds totally normal, right? That there is a community building practice for teachers. But that's not the case in most teacher training programs. And I don't want to take for granted how important it is to say out loud that this is an essential element of what it means to come and create a classroom community, which then, as we know about creating culture, every little piece matters, right? So if your classroom community isn't thriving, there's no way that your larger school community is going to thrive. And so just naming as they do, that you have to build a practice and you have to educate teachers to be prepared for this and to intentionally create community is just such an important reminder. And I hope that the people running teacher training programs today are reading this, because what I often find with new teachers, make me more Del Ed teachers because there's not enough of them, right? But they're showing up without these tools and these skills. And the other thing I would say is like, we know that classroom community is essential for students to be able to show up as their best selves, to take risks. And that's what we need right now, right? The being part of diverse community, especially when the world around us is not modeling it, it's a risk. It means I'm going to do something different than what I'm doing, than what I'm seeing in my home, right? Which reflects, which I'll go to in a moment about the pluralism chapter, but as a child or as an adolescent or as a teen, I'm going to be willing to be in dialogue in ways that I see my parents are not, or my grandparents are not, or the rabbi in my shul is not, right? And so to be willing to do that, there has to be real community in the classroom and real invitation for this. And to do that well, teachers need real training to do it successfully. I would also say that for new teachers who maybe don't have this kind of training, it's the first thing to go, right? They get so overwhelmed by everything they have to teach. I have to teach the content. I have diverse learners in my classroom. I have kids who have various needs. And the first thing that they're willing to let go of, I wouldn't say willing, but they don't even realize they let go of it, is that deep commitment to creating a community among their students, right? I watch, the morning meeting, the morning greeting, how we want our teachers to stand there and greet the children. And I notice by December, when kids are walking into the classroom, what happened to the person standing at the door? Where did they go? Oh, they're looking at their computer, emailing a parent, right? I hear you that like you're worried that the parent needs a response, but actually the most important thing you're going to do today is stand at the door and welcome that student into the classroom. And so what I found so remarkable about this chapter and what's helping, like what the training here is the layers of training into how do you build a classroom community. So it starts with just learning, right? The Del Ed participants are learning about classroom community. Then they start to make plans for their own classroom communities. Then they observe their mentor teachers' community building practices. And so they start to, what I love, and then finally they imagine their own. So what I love about this is it's not only there's no prescript community is personal, right? It's about who's in the room with you. So the tools and strategies that you have when when you're in school and you learn how to do something, right? They're tools and they're a toolbox, but you have to know who you are as an educator and who the people are that are in front of you. And so what's so beautiful about this is it's a training both in, I'm going to give you tools, you're going to observe someone else do this, but ultimately you have to name your own strategy and your own plan and your own path forward, because every year you're going to have a different group of kids, and what worked from your toolbox the previous year might not work for the coming year. And so I find I spend so much time thinking about what's not working in a classroom. It is often that the community is not thriving and not there. And this chapter really reminds us that we have to be training our teachers, whether it's in pre-service or while they're in our classrooms, not only in giving them tools and skills to be able to do this, but also empowering them to find their own voice in how they're going to build these communities. So really, thank you for that really important reminder. I want to move to the chapter, to Shevitz's chapter 11 on orienting students to engage with pluralism. What I love about this so much is it's really just about explicit instruction, right? It's about to create culture, right? Ask anyone who's ever worked with me or talked to me about anything. I live in the culture, in the bullseye of culture, right? What's at the center? Our beliefs and assumptions, and then our values, and then our artifacts, right? All of these things have to be in alignment as we think about culture. But how do you get to culture? You get to culture through explicit instruction and communication and experiences around pluralism. And that's what Shevitz talks about here. Because if they're only the implicit and the explicit need to go hand in hand in creating culture. And what we're seeing is that both the implicit and the explicit outside of our school walls are counter to the work that we're trying to do. And so really, like, what's so beautiful about this chapter is that it gives very specific examples, right? There's this really strong orientation for students around what are the words we're going to use, right? What's the language we're going to use? Let's name it, let's label it, let's identify it. And let's talk about the terms that are then going to kind of be woven throughout your experience here. We're going to say out loud, these are our expectations for you to being part of the community. We're not going to, it's about clear messaging, right? It's about students, this is really beautiful and beautifully said in the chapter. Students they're trying to create students who will seriously engage with ideas, live in the gray zone of ambiguity, and express their views while being open to others' perspectives. This is I'm going to hang it on the wall, right? And it's where I live all the time. And I think that I think we sometimes forget that we need to just keep saying it over and over again, right? What she talks about in this article is it's about the orientation before school starts. It's about the ceremonies and the experiences that are happening throughout. It's about aligning every single thing that you're doing to the culture that you're trying to build, while simultaneously saying out loud what that culture is. And I think the implicit and explicit is so important here. And I think sometimes we forget about it. So I really appreciate this sort of it's really fortifying and strengthening for me of as I sort of feel the culture, the kind of the polarized culture creeping in and taking over, and we know how to push back, and this chapter really reminds us that we have the tools to do it. We just have to actually name them, and we have to make sure that everything we're doing really aligns with them. And I want to end with the chapter 13, which is Ludwig's sort of experience of Latin students in Jewish day schools. And I really loved this chapter so much. It was really something that's new for me. I mean, I think a lot about sort of diversity and multiculturalism, but I think what I appreciated the most about this chapter is really about bringing your full self into school with you, and what it means for a student to feel fully seen. The beginning, the content. I'll share this quote was like really really powerful framing for me, right? In this context, the pedagogy of Jewish peoplehood should be understood as culturally responsive, student-centered frameworks for teaching that take into account the racial and cultural experiences of students in making school relevant to them. Talks about foundational in the formation of caring teacher-student relationships and in establishing belonging. I love this idea of the pedagogy of Jewish peoplehood, right? And understanding it as culturally responsive. The student in the chapter, he talks about the students feeling like they're able to bring their full selves and they don't have to act white. It's just like such an interesting and powerful statement to say, I want you to show up as your full self. It's not, you don't only belong here if you show up the way other people look, but you actually belong here as your full self with your own cultural norms and references. And it's my job as the teacher to learn you, right? Not you having to learn me or us. It's actually our job to figure out who you are and your norms and references and to integrate those into our classroom spaces so you get to show up as you, not as you pretending to be someone else. And I think that sort of is a beautiful kind of ending here for how I'm thinking about and kind of feeling this fortification around the the commitment to community and a culture of community and a culture of openness and curiosity, especially as the world around us really tries to shut that down, is that we have to figure out how to continue to be in relationship with each other as our full selves. And I think the chapters in this book really help us to remember and to learn how to do that well as we build our school communities around this.
Amanda, thank you so much. That's such a both hard dilemma of practice. Of course, not surprising, but hard. And it's like so wonderful to sort of hear the ways in which you're finding hope and a sense of inspiration in these essays. So thank you so much for sharing that. Dan, I know that you come with a little bit of a different perspective. So tell us about a dilemma of practice that you encounter and how some of these articles help you think about it.
Great. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about the interplay between teaching and learning, which this book is really about, and the business of schools, which is recruitment and retention of students. But let me just begin with a bit of an apology. Our kids bring home so many wonderful things from school. This week, my kids brought home colds. So my voice is a little rough and my head is a little stuffy. Everyone, forgive me for that. But really, what a blessing this book and these individual contributions are to the field of day school education. There's a thirst to pair research with practice, and the conversation between these is critical to a field that is dynamic and needs to be reflective of a pedagogy that changes with the times and the needs of students and their families. So, I'm so thankful to the editors, to the Mandel Center, to the authors for putting this together, and to you all for putting this webinar together. So instead of focusing on the pedagogic implementations, I'm going to talk about the implications for the business of schools. Much of what I do at Federation and here at the Koshitsky Center for Jewish Education is about school recruitment, enrollment, affordability, financial sustainability. Key to this is understanding the factors that families weigh in their choice of school. At the end of the day, parents are making a choice. With this in mind, I was really excited to read the chapters by Sharon Avni on what parents are looking for in Hebrew education, by Josh Layden on 3 conceptions of rabbinics, by Yaakov Jaffe on 4 approaches to the instruction of halakha, and I'm going to play a little bit with how those play out in terms of recruitment and retention. I know that both Sharon and Yaakov name the implications for how we articulate the goals of day schools to parents. Sharon says, what do parents want their children to learn in Hebrew classes? How do they talk about these goals? How do they define a successful Hebrew education and a successful Hebrew program? She also notes that while parental decision-making has always been an issue in day school education, it's often remained at the level of enrollment choices that families face between day schools and public schools. And I'd say, while she names that, similarly in the discussion about halakha, Yaakov states that schools right now are not explicit to themselves or to their parents about things like where their priorities lie, where greater time investment should be made, whether skill development, knowledge acquisition, or conversation on or conservation of beliefs should be the focus of the curriculum. And I think at this place between the implicit things of what happens in schools and the explicit way in which we narrate or describe this to prospective parents and current parents is really key to this whole conversation around the business of schools. You can hear my voice going, so I'm going to take a little schlug. With this in mind, we also have to remind ourselves that parents are choosing Jewish education, right? The parents in our schools are making a choice, and frankly, very often an expensive choice. But there are different markets, right? Depending on the market, some are choosing between Jewish day schools, others are choosing between day schools and independent schools, and still others are choosing between day schools and publicly funded schools. And those 3 differences in the market are really important. And the choices even within these sectors are different. So the choices between those choosing Orthodox schools and non-Orthodox schools, etc., etc. In the chapter on Hebrew education, Avni studies 2 different 5th grade Hebrew classes in a non-Orthodox elementary school. The study is rich and gives really, really great insight into that school. But the school is a sample of one. And I think one of the things that we have to remember is that each school is idiosyncratic in that respect, both in terms of what their pedagogy is and in terms of who their audience is. So we've done some work here in Toronto around understanding parents and teachers and students' interests in terms of Hebrew. And I'll paint three different caricatures. Right? One of our elementary schools might say by the end of 8th grade, we want our students to be able to go to Israel and order a falafel. A second one might say by the end of 8th grade, we want the students to be able to go to shul on Shabbat morning and navigate the Siddur, or go to shul on Shabbat morning and read a Haftorah. And a third one might say, by the end of 8th grade, we want them to be able to open a Chumash and decode and understand Rashi. Those are very different conceptions and goals that the schools portray about what they are looking for in terms of developing their students in terms of Hebrew. They also represent different goals of parents. And parents are looking for success in different areas. And in some ways, we have to find that congruence between what the school is doing and what the parent is doing, and what the parent is looking for. It's important for us to listen to parent voices to find a meeting point between parents' desired outcomes and the school's intended goals. That's Hebrew, and that was a really fascinating and rich chapter. We also know that investment in Hebrew could sometimes come at an opportunity cost for other areas like rabbinics and halacha, which I'll say a few words about now. Leighton lays out three conceptions of the teaching of rabbinics, which he derived from deep experience in the field, as well as interviews with teachers across a diverse number of settings to understand their thinking. He titles three different conceptions: rabbinics as a canonized corpus. In this conception, texts are intrinsically interrelated. Mastery is about understanding how the context and the text are related, the ability to recall information and see how one text speaks to the other. The second is rabbinics as an ecology. In this view, the texts are diverse in time, in origin, and authors, and rabbinics is really an expanding field that's growing over time. The text can be fallible and thus disconnected from a complete coherent system. So that differentiates itself from the first conception. And the third is about rabbinics as a thought process. Rabbinics is a mode of thinking more than a collection of texts. It's about the interpretive process and teaching kids the interpretive process about how we deal with the texts. The conversations that are animated by rabbinics. And it is this thought process that is key. So I say this because just as I laid out three different visions for Hebrew in our elementary schools in Toronto, so too Leighton demonstrates that there are different visions for rabbinics. But he describes these three conceptions put forward by teachers, but for me the question of defining the value proposition for schools is the extent to which the school has an overarching philosophy of how or what they are teaching in rabbinics, and if they're able to articulate that philosophy to current or prospective families, both for the purpose of recruitment and retention. And I'll move on to the question of halacha. So similarly, in this discussion of the teaching of halacha, and in his chapter, Jaffe offers four approaches. One is the focus on content required to prepare students for a life where they will keep halacha. A second is that based on the learning of procedural knowledge, the skills, where students learn skills needed for halachic practice, they'll be able to apply those skills. The third is based on a notion of cultural literacy, that in order to be able to operate as literate Jews, one must know certain things. It's very Hirschian. And the fourth is that to enable students to acquire beliefs and values as derived from halacha, that halacha can teach us certain underlying beliefs and values that play out in our lives. I'm sure we can all imagine how these frameworks could be applied pedagogically and how they might look different in a variety of different schools and settings. But to me, in what I'm talking about today, the question becomes one of congruence between the school's goals and that of parents, and to what extent do we articulate to parents the school's philosophical framework? Jaffe states, is the focus on growing students' knowledge base about Judaism? Is it on developing students' ability to live Judaism? Or is it on ensuring a commitment to Judaism long term? And the school being able to articulate to parents what their goals are allows families to be able to find the right fit. So let me conclude by saying I love these questions, right? Like they are so rich and enticing to me as someone who was a teacher, as someone who's a parent, as someone who works in the field of education. And I'm thinking back a decade ago when my wife and I were considering schools for our eldest, who was nearing kindergarten at the time. And by the way, is now graduating 8th grade, and we're thinking about her next steps, right? So when we went to look at schools, we asked the school to look at 8th grade classrooms. because we wanted to see what was happening not only in kindergarten, but in the upper grades when teaching becomes more nuanced. This was not the usual tour that schools provide. What they wanted to do was they wanted to walk us around the kindergarten class because that's what most parents look for. And the truth is that most parents who are choosing a day school aren't going to drill into the underlying goals of Ivrit, of rabbinics, or halacha. They aren't going to interrogate the recruitment director or the head of school on Leiden's concepts of rabbinics and how that manifests in the schools. Like, halavai, that should be what's actually happening. And we know that, going back to one of the things that Tali said, like, many parents, especially in the non-Orthodox sector, are probably going to drill down more on the teaching of reading, writing, and arithmetic than they will on the conceptions of teaching rabbinics, right? But we also know that the key for the school is both recruitment and retention, and an overall question of fit. Even if we don't go into detail with prospective kindergarten families, I still believe that having an internal philosophy, which these three works will help schools develop, is key to the value proposition of the school and key to be able to develop the school community, which will manifest not just in kindergarten, but in K through 8 or K through 12, whatever that school becomes, and assist both in recruitment and retention. So this really becomes a rich conversation about, like, not only how do we develop teaching and learning, which is the title of the book, but also how does teaching and learning have implications for the way that the school projects itself in the business of schools, who are we recruiting, who are we retaining, etc. If I can, I'm going to take this moment to ask Tali a question. Tali, I was really, really interested in this notion of, because I have to show the book, this notion of the Venn diagram, right? And what Schleifer said is the synthesis of the two parts of education and how they sort of occupy the same day, but they may just run in parallel pieces. And I'm interested in, like, your 5 lenses, and as you as a leader in the education sector, how do you think about bringing those things together so that parents can actually conceptualize these as Jewish day schools as one whole rather than 2 separate parts of a day?
Yes. Beautiful question. It is, in a way, the question. I feel like Amanda, really, your work is the stitching together of that quilt every day. I think it depends on the nature of the quilt that any community is going for. So the vision for a thriving, delicious Jewish life looks really different in different communities. And so how you stitch together and the tools with which you use to kind of bring the secular and the religious, the general and the traditional together are gonna look different. For me personally, I will give a tiny, very personal anecdote for what this looks like, just like a microcosm. Before my kids became bat mitzvah, like literally when they were born, I was like, oh my God, how am I going to make the bar mitzvah authentic? A kid who's 12 is not an adult. A kid who's 13 is not an adult. And so I made a list on my phone at that point of things that seemed like realistic adult responsibilities that a 12 or 13-year-old could take on in the general or the Jewish sector. And it was a mixed list. One of them that was a point of tension was being able to eat on the couch. It was a big, big deal. They all got very excited that when they become bar mitzvah, they can eat on the couch because crumbs are annoying, right? But there was also things like, can you choose your level of kashrut when you become bar mitzvah? And my husband and I decided that that would be something they were allowed to do, not inside the home where we decide, but outside the home they can then choose. But only as a result of kind of thinking about sort of 7 steps leading up to the 8-step model of Ziva, that it was in the context of having been raised with a thick experience and knowledge about what kashrut is and what it could be and mean. Anyway, I had like 15, 20 of these on my phone by the time they became bar mitzvah. And that was my effort to kind of live in that teal strip of how can I stitch together living in these worlds and making the bar mitzvah meaningful. But it's a huge question, Dan. It's big. It's the stakes feel higher and higher. I really related to Amanda's the heaviness in her heart and the inspiration that you bring to the work. I have a related question for you, Amanda. You had a phrase that I wrote down because it took me. You said, the community is personal, which feels like a paradoxical claim. And I'd love to like invite you to double click on that a little bit. Tell me more about how the community is personal for you. How does that happen? It feels right, but I just want to hear more about it.
I remember a bunch of years ago, I was talking to a prospective family, and they asked me because our school is one that has a very wide range of diversity in Jewish practice. We're in Brooklyn. We have families coming, Chabad families coming from Crown Heights, and we have families with one Jewish parent and everybody in between. And they asked me something about, well, what happens if this happens? And I said, at this moment, I don't have anyone in the school who's dealing with that issue. But if and when we do, then we will deal with it as a community, right? I said, like, I don't want to worry about or, think about the people who aren't here. I want to actually look at who's in front of us and tend to them and create space for them and kind of work and build together with them. I think that we've been having a conversation recently among our faculty around who are the students in front of us, because the students in front of us today are not the same students who were in front of us 5 years ago. I think there's so many reasons why that is. But if we keep approaching both pedagogy, community building, all the pieces, right, from the lens of how we've always done it, or who we've been, or who our community has been, I think we're missing the mark, actually. And so I think that there are values and beliefs and assumptions that we need to hold at the center, right? The mission, to Dan's point, like, what's the mission, right? What is the mission of your institution? How are we building a culture around that mission? And how are we living that mission? Those are very important questions. But how we live the mission, I believe, changes with the people that are in front of us and how they're showing up and what's going on for them. And I think that matters as a school community, and that matters in the classroom. And so the things that are, and I think actually the Ludwig's chapter also, this piece of like, who is showing up? You've been using the word authenticity, and I think it's really important here. I don't want to, there's a lot of talk about like diversity and making sure but I want that to be authentic also. I don't want to pretend like there are people who are here who are not here, and I want to honor the people who are here and have those conversations. So I think there's many layers of it. I think the beliefs and assumptions and values don't change. I think those have to be central and essential. But I think the how and who we are and who the community we build together is really about and needs to be about who's in the room. And I think it's our responsibility to approach it that way, because then we're really honoring who's in the room rather than thinking about a fictional, right, abstract or fictional, or the thing we're kind of imagining or designing.
Fabulous.
Really
Yeah, and I love that we're now not just holding it up, but holding it up for a reason, to sort of point out the Venn diagram. I think that I want to conclude. I hope that the audience heard some of the questions that were coming at us addressed in the various responses. But to conclude, that sort of focusing on teaching and learning in Jewish day schools is in itself somewhat subversive as a title and as a focus. When we're sort of doing Jewish education in the context of the marketplace, in the context of the neoliberal conditions that we're living under, we can often feel like the driving force is the demands of the consumer. But of course, in the context of Jewish community, what you heard across all three, even Dan, who is exclusively focused on retention and recruitment, is that schools have identities, schools have values. That's harder than ever today. Some of those values are explicitly about pedagogy and the teaching and learning. Some of them are about the culture that goes into the teaching and learning, and that those are at the center of what we do in Jewish education, and that we insist that they're in the center. Amanda, the way that you ended sort of by saying how we sort of shape that or redact that in relationship with who's in the room is incredibly important. But the other side of that, and what we stand for, is always there. And I think that in itself is an inspiring message. And this idea that the children are changing, that communities are changing, that parents change, that schools have parents actually through often 15 years of life, if not more. And humans are changing people. Who you get as a kindergarten parent is not who you say goodbye to on their third, fourth child in 8th grade. And so that sort of voice throughout saying, we have ideas about teaching and learning. We want to make sure that those ideas stay center as we serve in changing times and changing people, is what I'm taking from sort of how you all made sense of these incredible studies. I want to thank you guys so much for really pouring your heart into this book as readers, and inviting us into that. It was incredibly inspiring and reminds me of the power of reading. John, I'm going to give you the last word.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ziva, for hosting this event, for designing the conversation. Really rich responses from Amanda, Tali, Dan. Incredibly generous and insightful reading of the book. There's nothing that a person wants more as an author or editor than to have people read with as much insight and bring as much to the reading as you've done and that you've now shared with us. So thank you all for that. I want to thank the chapter authors of the book. I'm not going to name all 13 authors. Ziva is one of them, but you heard about them along the way. And of course, I also want to thank my co-editors, Jonathan Krasner, who was the lead editor, and then also Sharon Avni. I neglected to mention her earlier, which was really, I was remiss in that. But Sharon Avni was our partner in this work, and we appreciate her contributions as well. On behalf of the Mandel Center, our next event is on January 15th. It will be a Learning About Learning session with Benji Davis about on the topic Jewish educators' response to "You Never Told Me," which has become a little bit of a slogan in Jewish education, especially around Israel. Please remember to sign up for our mailing list, follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn, and in particular, you can, if you're interested in the book and you want to track down a copy, you can get there through the center. We posted a link earlier for the material. So thank you all for this conversation about teaching and learning Jewish day schools. Thank you all for joining us in the audience. Take care.